Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and this episode we are going over Chapter 2 of Man's Search for Meaning, Logotherapy in a Nutshell, specifically pages 97 through 117. If you remember, Chapter 1 was experiences in a concentration camp. So Chapter 1 was a lot of Victor's personal stories and things that he went through. We'll see as we go through 97 through 117 in this brand new chapter. This now turns into a different part of the book where Victor's kind of doing a deep dive into logotherapy, what it means, how it works. So there's not too many personal stories. There are some, but as far as like any more stories about the life in the concentration camp, that was left in Chapter 1. This is more the theory behind what Victor kind of talks about and alludes to in Chapter 1. So this is so far very interesting, as we are going to see. Victor starts by doing a comparison because he has this passage right there on 97 where somebody asks him, I am reminded, an American doctor turned up in my office in Vienna and asked me, now, doctor, are you a psychoanalyst? So this kind of leads to a discussion about what's the difference between psychoanalysis and logotherapy. So I didn't do a lot of research on this, and maybe somebody in the comments can illuminate this, but I think maybe the dominating form of therapy, psychological therapy, was psychoanalysis. So I think this stems from Freud. And like the American doctor is describing to Victor, or as Victor talks about, when he's discussing his discussion with this American doctor, psychoanalysis, you're laying down on a couch and you're exposing your problems, your issues, your thoughts to the therapist, and then your therapist kind of then tries to like weave through and give his take on your thoughts. If this is classic stuff that you see in movies. This is stuff you saw in Sopranos with Dr. Melfi and Tony. It's just like a very classic. This is the thing that I think about when you go to a psychiatrist or go to a psychologist. And as Victor talks about, psychoanalysis is telling the therapist things that are very disagreeable to tell. In logotherapy, the roles are switched kind of. It's reversed. The patient hears things which are disagreeable. Psychoanalysis is less retrospective, less introspective. And then logotherapy is the opposite of that kind of. It is very introspective, meaning-centered, focuses on the future. So you are learning. In logotherapy, you are learning, because it really is learning. It's not a judgment, whereas whereas psychoanalysis, like you make judgment calls on why you're thinking these certain things, and, it's really symbolism because you have, these unfulfilled issues with people in your life, and they're manifesting themselves in other ways. But Victor says, it's meanings and drives, or it's meaning versus the drives and instincts that psychoanalysis tries to get at. So logotherapy is about meaning. Psychoanalysis is like what's driving you to do that and why are you doing it. Logotherapy, though, is future-focused. It wants to get you on a right path, get you on a goal, get you living for something that's worthwhile living. And sometimes that is very disagreeable to hear. Right? And Victor's going to talk about later how, this is something that you would often go to a member of your church or the temple, some religious figure. You'd go to maybe like a mentor at work or your dad. But now people are often going to medical professionals to seek out answers to things, when, remember what we talked about, it's not you getting meaning out of life, it's life getting something out of you. So they're trying to find answers to things that from a medical professional, when really they need to be looking internally into themselves to find those answers. And again, the meaning of life is not a good question to ask. That question differs between person to person. What would life have you do? Right? What would life have you do? What's life asking out of you? And that's not to say that people don't get benefit from psychoanalysis. There's people who probably do need that. But we should really take a step back and kind of assess the situation on, hey, do I really need this, or do I need logotherapy? Do I need meaning in my life? And then maybe things would kind of work themselves out. Let's continue. Man needs something. You gotta live for something. Meanings and values are not defense mechanisms, as is Victor kind of alludes to with psychoanalysis, where you're trying to find symbols, meanings, and why do these meanings and values pop up? Are they defense mechanisms against something that you're not telling the therapist? Oh, no, man needs something. He cites a public opinion poll here. 89% of people polled admitted that man needs something for the sake of which to live. And a survey of some college students at the time, and they asked them what was very important to them now. 16% said making a lot of money, and 78% said finding a purpose and meaning in life. This was very interesting. I was expecting something of the opposite here. Like, I thought college students, you're still young. Frontal lobe hasn't been formed. I mean, you're still learning a ton. I would have thought that 78% would have said making a lot of money, because that's, you go to college thinking that that's the goal. You want to get a good job, make a ton of money. And then later in life, you realize, hey, the chase for money is not the final purpose. And then later in life, if you were to poll these same students, it would flip to this arrangement that you see here. So I was kind of surprised that it was like this. I don't know any other information about these students, in what time period this was in. And maybe a similar poll like this today would be different in today's world versus post-World War II. It'd be interesting to test that. So noogenic, existential frustration. So what is existential frustration? How I kind of interpreted this, because Victor talks about, he has a whole section here, existential frustration. The term existential can be used in three ways, he says. Existence itself, the meaning of existence, and striving to find a concrete meaning in personal existence. That is to say, the will to meaning. So I think people get frustrated, people get discouraged when they don't have a meaning. They don't see a meaning in their life. They don't see a future. So they get worked up about it. And they get distressed from it. And he was saying how from this, neuroses can come about, specifically noogenic neuroses. And noogenic comes from nous, comes from Greek, Noos, comes from Greek, meaning mind. So they have like an origin in somebody's mind. Not psychological, but noological. Organization. And this is something that I got just from the internet. I think it was from Wikipedia. Organization of thought, knowledge, mind. Different from psychological. It almost seems like these would be the same thing, but I don't know if psychological would mean, more so to do with the brain and brain function. And this is thinking and the mind. And I think there is a difference between the brain and the mind. The brain, the physical structure, and the mind, like how you are thinking and your mindset on things. So maybe that'll be a challenge question we pose. What is the difference between these two? He continues on in a section called noogenic neuroses. And he's saying here that it's the result not from conflicts between drives and instincts, but from these existential problems. So the existential problems of not having a worthy meaning to live for is probably the main existential problem that Victor is getting at here. And when you don't have that set, I'm going to say when you don't have that set, because when you do have it, yes, you are still going to experience issues, trials, tribulations, and obstacles, maybe even some suffering from it. But that is going to be different than if you don't even have that goal, that meaning to live for. So this frustration, existential frustration, is not a sign of something's wrong with you, but it's just a sign, I think, that you're going through a growing period in your life, and that I put here that it's necessary. It's probably necessary that you go through this, because it means that you're on the right track. It's kind of like in Alcoholics Anonymous. I think like the first step is just admitting you have a problem, right? And that's, I think, with the frustration, you're recognizing that there is an issue. And you can't solve the issue until you know that it's an issue, right? So that's why I put here that I think that this is almost a necessary thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not something that you need to like fix, like it's a issue, but it is something that you need to overcome. And then I wrote down here, oftentimes this frustration can get buried, but should be brought to light. Remember, back in chapter 1, we were talking about this, how Victor, what was it? He was telling a story about how when he was wondering like why he was so angry at this one moment in time in the camp, and it was because, I forget the reason why he was angry, but he said that he got over it by just going by shedding light on why he was angry. He knew why he was angry. I think he knew why, but he was trying to bury it like, no, I just don't want to think about it, and then maybe it'll go away. But it ended up going away by him just meditating on it, being mindful about it, talking about it to himself, bringing it to light. Don't shy away from it. Go right at it and confront it. Let's continue on. Noodynamics. This was the next kind of section, and he kind of titles it's a chapter 2, but he actually has like headings for some of these, so it kind of breaks it up a little more, which is kind of nice. The noodynamics here. Continuing on kind of what we were talking about. The search for meaning will result in tension rather than equilibrium. But again, necessary? I think so. I mean, that's the point I think that Victor gets at here. If you're seeking if you think that life is just a constant homeostasis, and he does use that word here, like a homeostasis, so like a balance between two poles, then that's not reality. And ultimately, you will get more frustrated and less happy. But instead, the results from seeking something that's larger than you and the tension that comes with that, that keeps you pushing through life. That keeps you alive. That keeps you on a track. And once that train gets momentum and it's going, that train is hard to stop. And it can go and go and go. So Victor talks about this with his manuscript here. Do you remember the manuscript was taken from him, right? And he was wondering, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to no, excuse me. This was when he got sick. When he got sick with typhus, he said that reproducing his manuscript helped him survive. So he talks about this on page 104. For instance, when in a camp in Bavaria I fell ill with typhus fever, I jotted down on little scraps of paper many notes intended to enable me to rewrite the manuscript should I live to the day of liberation. And then I am sure that this reconstruction of my lost manuscript in the dark barracks of a Bavarian concentration camp assisted me in overcoming the danger of a cardiovascular collapse. Kept them moving towards a goal. I fully believe that. That happens. I mean, that's happened in my life. Think about it. That's probably happened in places in your lives too. On page 105, this is where he talks about that homeostasis. In that, your happiness is not a tensionless state. It's the result of driving towards a goal. It's the result of, kind of like what Victor talks about in the introduction. Success is, you shouldn't be driving just for success or money. That's the offshoot of all the work you put in, but you don't specifically say you're going to go do that. You don't specifically think that you're going to make that money or be really successful. It's just the result of doing something that you have a lot of passion to do. And he uses this analogy that I kind of mentioned. One pole is the meaning and the other is the man striving to fulfill that meaning. And he uses this example of an arch. If you want to strengthen an arch, you increase the load on the arch. Think about that. You don't reinforce it with more, concrete, metal. You don't say, hey, we're going to have a lighter capacity on this arch, so not too many people can walk over this archway. No, you increase the load on it, because then that causes the arch to constrict more together and bind more firmly together. He says, for the parts are joined more firmly together. Let's continue on. Existential vacuum, page 106. So, what is the existential vacuum? I think what he meant by this, think about a vacuum, empty space, right? Like think about space. I mean, space isn't empty, but the vacuum of space, I think I've heard that term before. And I think this emptiness, this existential emptiness, comes from not having a meaning. So Victor talks about here on this page how man went from animal instincts of survival to the freedom of choice. So early man was just living to survive. He didn't have all these things afforded to him that we do in modern society. You had to go out hunt food. You had to go out make shelter. All these things. Wasn't very comfortable. You had to work really hard for it. But as modern society came about, technology came about, and it freed up our time, right? And freed us up to make choices. Because with early days and animal instincts, they don't have a choice. They have to do that or die. But now you had the freedom of choice of leisure, right? So now people get caught up in an emptiness like, what do I do with my time? And he talks about here, no instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. So he says here, he like relies, he does what other people do, or he relies on what people tell him to do. But he doesn't make the choice himself. And this can result, like I said, in boredom. I think that's what he was getting at here with this vacuum. There's sort of a boredom, like, what do I do next? I don't really need to worry about the things that early ancestors need to worry about. So what do I do next? He talks about this survey between European students and American students. 25% of the European students surveyed said were exhibiting being in this existential vacuum, but 60% of the Americans. And I thought that was interesting, and that's actually one of the questions that I am going to ask in the challenge questions for next time. Why do you think there's this huge difference between Europeans and Americans? And I wonder if this exists today like it is. I don't know. But I'd like to find out more about that. That is a very, very, very big difference. And Victor talks about how, and this kind of is true today, how automation is going to lead to, I mean, we have had automation for a while now, but even more so. Think about driverless cars, driverless trucks, AI. This is going to lead to more free time for workers. But are people going to know what to do with their free time? That's the question. And will this percentage of Americans in this existential vacuum increase? That's the question. Sunday neurosis. I think what he meant by this, and I put retirees here, is that the feeling that you get, and I remember I used to get this when I dealt with my issues a few years ago. Sundays were a high anxiety day for me because I knew that I still had to go into work Monday at a job that I did not want to be at. So you get very worked up about it. And I know I've talked to other people who get the same way. As far as the retirees, think about when you retire, maybe you might end up in this existential vacuum. All of a sudden you were working and now you don't have to work. What are you going to do? A lot of people get meaning from the work they do, but how are you now going to fulfill that time so you don't end up in this existential vacuum? Let's continue. The will to meaning is replaced by will to pleasure, money, power, sexual compensation. So he talks about this with the vacuum, I believe it was. Let me see if I can find it. I think this was in regards to the vacuum. I'm pretty sure. Because the will to meaning, that's the ultimate goal here. But what oftentimes ends up happening when you are in the vacuum, this gets replaced by these other frivolous things. You're seeking pleasure, money, power, sex. He was saying how libido rises a ton in the existential vacuum. I'm trying to think what page this was on. It must have been like 110 or something, but he kind of says here to kind of be careful. Don't get caught up in these. This is what you really want. Because this is hard. It's going to be a struggle. You might suffer through it. And maybe through these, like these are hard to get to, right? Money, power, right? These might be hard to come by too, but are you getting any meaning out of that? What's the real reason why you're going for this? Right? What's the real reason if there's no meaning behind this, then this doesn't mean anything. There's always a bigger fish. There's always a bigger fish here that has more power. So he was kind of, in my opinion, kind of giving like a warning in regards to all of those things. The meaning of life, page 108. This is something that we've talked about many times before. The specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment, and this differs from person to person. It's like he tells this story about a chess player. Tell me, master, what is the best move in the world? And he says, there simply is no such thing as the best or even a good move apart from a particular situation in a game and a particular personality of one's opponent. Right, so it depends on the situation. There is no best chess move. What's the situation? And then we got to go from there. It's entirely dependent on the context. And again, like we've said this before, it's not about asking what the meaning of life is, but rather that life is asking of you something. Life is depending on you for something. You're not depending on life. The essence of existence. This was another section. This was interesting. He talks about this quote right here. This was the categorical imperative of logotherapy. So live as if you were living for the second time and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you're about to act now. This right here, I'm trying to understand this quote. He talks about this page 109. He says, it seems like to me that there's nothing which would stimulate a man's sense of responsibleness more than this maxim, which invites him to imagine first that the present is past, and second, that the past may yet be changed and amended. Such a precept confronts him with life's finiteness as well as finality of what he makes out of both his life and himself. And that logotherapy tries to make you responsible for your life. So maybe this is kind of like a warning. So the first time you acted wrongly, and you're about to act wrongly now unless you change something. And he goes on to talk about how it's up to the patient. The therapist should not be kind of the main actor in this, and it should not judge you in your journey. So the difference between an eye doctor and a painter, like this painter is going to paint what he sees, put his symbolism on it, whereas an eye doctor, and specifically here, page 110, a painter tries to convey to us a picture of the world as he sees it. An ophthalmologist tries to enable us to see the world as it really is. So a therapist in logotherapy should be more like the eye doctor, less a painter. You got to widen and broaden the visual field of the patient so that he becomes more conscious, and the goal and the meaning becomes more visible to him. You're really just kind of getting out of the way and letting the patient kind of figure it out himself in a way when it's all said and done. And that meaning is discovered in the world. It's not going to be in your mind. It's going to come through action. We've used this word multiple times. Action. That's out in the world. That's you putting in the work. I believe there is benefits to meditating, visualizing. I think those are very beneficial, but ultimately it's the action. And you shouldn't seek this self-actualization. Rather, you should seek the self-transcendence, bettering yourself. And then this comes along with it. This might be another good question here. Hang on, before I forget, let's just actualization and self-transcendence. Yeah, just so I don't forget. Let's continue on to this is on page 111, the meaning of life. Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. So what Victor kind of goes on to say in this section is that through love, you reach the innermost parts of a man. And the person that you love helps you on your journey and sees the potential in you. By making him aware of what he can be and what he should become, he makes these potentialities come true. And I think I spelled that. I think I meant to do this. Our suffering. Attitude we take towards our suffering. And this was something we mentioned earlier. Suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning. This is kind of similar in a way to what we talked about when you're going through something, you bring it to light. You face it up front. You don't try to bury it. So this is kind of similar. You want the suffering, once it finds a meaning, then the suffering's just like you putting in the work. It's not something you shy away from anymore, you know? Yeah, I'm sure like running a few miles would suck in the beginning, but then once you see the results of it, you lose a little weight, you feel a little better, then it's not suffering anymore. Then you realize that, hey, I like the results of this. He goes on to talk about a man who lost his wife. This was on page 112 through 113. So he lost his wife, and he's talking about how he really misses her and how he wishes that he would have died. And Victor says, well, okay, if you had died first and your wife would have survived you, what would have happened? And he said, for her, this would have been very terrible, and she would have suffered greatly. And so Victor says, well, doctor, don't you see, you've spared her. Such a suffering has been spared of her. And now it is you who are doing the suffering, not her. And this kind of like turned his world upside down. And it says here, he said no word but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. And then he goes on, I did succeed in changing his attitude toward his unalterable fate, inasmuch as from that time on, he could at least see a meaning in his suffering. So the perspective changed a lot. I say here, and this is something Victor says, suffering is not necessary on this journey. In fact, if you can avoid suffering, you can still find meaning in your life. He says here specifically, if it were avoidable, however, the meaningful thing to do would be to remove its cause, be it psychological, biological, or political. To suffer unnecessarily is masochistic rather than heroic. So you shouldn't seek it out necessarily, but if it's standing in the way between you and something else, then yeah, you're going to need to overcome that obstacle. But you shouldn't be building up those obstacles yourself. Those will come about just naturally on their own. And I thought that that's a fair point that Victor makes. Victor talks about here Edith Weisskopf-Jolson, a professor, University of Georgia, that talks about this mental hygiene. So, quote, our current mental hygiene philosophy stresses the idea that people ought to be happy all the time. I added that part. That unhappiness is a symptom of maladjustment. Such a value system might be responsible for the fact that the burden of unavoidable unhappiness is increased by unhappiness about being unhappy. So I kind of think of this as we get so worked up about trying to be happy that constant trying to get this happiness, trying to fix whenever you're unhappy, it kind of ends up stressing you out and leading kind of nowhere. You just end up feeling more unhappy. This is especially true social media age when you play the comparison game. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is very true today. You're trying to fix the unhappiness instead of going right through it. You want to go around it. If that makes sense. Be proud of that suffering. Confront it. That's where you're going to get the meaning. That's where you're going to find the meaning. Victor tells the story about Shema Yisrael, and how this is where he talks about losing his manuscript when he first gets to camp. And he had on clothes from another inmate, and then in his pocket he finds this prayer, Shema Yisrael. How should I have interpreted such a coincidence other than as a challenge to live my thoughts instead of merely putting them on paper? So the manuscript that he lost, I'm sure he was distraught over it. But being the experiences that he had now gave him a chance to really live the words in his manuscript. And it ended up being very, very powerful. Obviously, this book is the result of that. So it gave him that chance. He had that choice to confront this loss of his manuscript and really live what he was talking about. Let's continue on here. Logo drama. This is the last part that we are going to go over here. He introduces a story of a mother and a crippled son, and how the mother had a lot of issues with it, and she felt like almost kind of sorry for the crippled son. And she tried to commit suicide with the son. The son ended up stopping it. The crippled son. The son ended up stopping it because the son still saw meaning where his mother didn't. His mother kind of saw that, oh my gosh, he's crippled. He's not going to be able to do the same things as a normal child. He can't bear to live. She just made that assumption. But no, the son still had a lot to live for. He stopped it. So he goes on to, they do like an exercise where he asks her, you know, would you rather have had a lot of money and no kids, or kept your kid and, you know, be in the situation that you're in? He kind of does this exercise with her, and, you know, and she, as they're doing this exercise as an old woman with the money, she kind of has regret over not having the children. And she actually says here, like, I must say, my life was a failure. Now he asks her to look back on her life as the mother to this crippled son, and she says, I have made a fuller life possible for him. Um, if I had not taken over his care, he would have been in an institution. Though he is crippled and helpless, he is, after all, my boy, and so I have made a fuller life possible for him. As for myself, I can look back peacefully on my life, for I can say my life was full of meaning. I have tried hard to fulfill it. My life was no failure. Kind of skipped around. It's a long passage. Um, so she ended up seeing the meaning of it. And again, money, replacing the will to meaning with the will to money, compensating for it, doesn't necessarily make things better. And she ended up seeing that, you know what, I can look back on my life and say I was there for my son. And I helped him in every single way possible. And he didn't end up being in an institution. He was my son. He was with me. She ended up getting a fuller life from that than if she was a millionaire, 80 years old, no kids. Right? We'll end this with the suffering ape analogy. So Victor talks about how, you know, he poses this question on an ape that was being used to develop a serum, like a vaccine, knew why it kept on getting punctured and punctured again by the needle. Do you think the ape would ever grasp the meaning of its suffering? Because the ape is being used to develop a serum, vaccine, whatever, for humanity. So that means a lot. That's going to help a lot of people. But does the ape know that? So the group was saying, no, it wouldn't. It wouldn't know. So now he poses the same question. And what about man? Are you sure that the human world is a terminal point in the evolution of the cosmos? So similar situation. Do you think that you know the meaning of the suffering that you're doing now? Do you know what the purpose of that will be? How that will help someone in the future? And does it just end at us? Is it not conceivable, he says, that there is still another dimension, a world beyond man's world, a world in which the question of an ultimate meaning of human suffering would find an answer? And that's how we end this section. Yeah, that is an interesting analogy. What would we be suffering for in a similar fashion to what the ape suffers for? That we don't know. We don't know why it's happening to us, but it's for something greater than us. That's for a greater purpose. I mean, how would an ape know that, right? It's not even like a dimensional thing. That's just like a cognitive thing. The ape's not going to comprehend that. So what are we not comprehending about the suffering, about the results of our suffering? Where does that go? Is that going to AI, or is that going to like something spiritual, God, Christ, something of that nature? It's very interesting. So I have a couple questions here. Do you think there is an overfocus on psychoanalysis today? Why do you think the results of the survey between Europeans and Americans is the way it is? And if we did the same survey today, would it be different? And what is the difference between self-actualization and self-transcendence? I'm trying to think, was there any other... There might have been... Oh, what's the difference between psychological and noological? That's a good one. My spelling might be off here. Oh, no. Okay, maybe not. Okay, yeah, these will be the questions. I'll post these in the description of this episode. Let me know what you guys think or if any other questions arise. Also, like I mentioned in the discussion episode, I might be adding some stuff to this channel. I thought about changing the name. I think I might keep the name for now, but I might add, in a similar fashion to how I'm doing this with books, I might do the same thing with the Bible, might do the same thing with a TV show as well. So we'll see. Let me know if you guys have listened this far. Let me know what you think about that. My name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash. Oh, for next time, we are going to read page 118 to 138. How about this? Page 118 to the postscript, because that'll be through the end of chapter 2. So just finish chapter 2 for next time, 118 to the end, about page 134. My name is Chris. Thank you for listening. This is Chee-Tash. I'll see you all next time.